Okay, welcome back to the Information Revolution, a podcast for people who are interested in information. Did I sound a bit hesitant there? Perhaps not. My name's Michael Upton, and I'm an information management consultant based in Wellington, New Zealand.
Hello, I'm Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect, also based in Wellington, New Zealand.
And I'm Karl Melrose. I'm an information management consultant based out of South Australia. And I think I'm kicking us off today, aren't I?
You are.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. So today I very cautiously floated the topic as custodial hangovers. And I'm not sure that was how we really agreed to talk about it, but the goal really is to look at the impact that custodial practices had on current day practice and to really think about how many of those practice patterns we've carried through into what we do now when the environment that they need to operate in is totally different. And, to just give that some color, pre 2000 ish, mostly paper, entirely custodial practice, people literally, giving us files and us holding them for them through a registry office type system of some kind where they register them with us, we describe them, keep them, and then they come back to get them. What we've got there is we have, and that's probably not a great description, but what we've got there is we've got a system of records management, which is organized and was created completely with the priorities of records management in mind and to do records management work. And then outside of the registry office, we have all of the other systems operating, the system that does development applications and the system that does loan approvals and the system that does all of these other things, where we have people who are fundamentally organizing and managing their information to achieve a completely different purpose to us. And once upon a time, during the custodial era, we had two very distinct systems here, and we had a nice demarcation point between them, that point at which the file would be handed over. And where I'm seeing this as something that we should all be thinking about together more and more is that I think most of what we did was we took that custodial practice and we said, oh, well, now we're electronic and it's not custodial, but this is what good records management looks like. And now all of you people, you've got access to this brilliant electronic records management system. And so now you need to do records management like that because we have X number of, hundreds, thousands, when was the Dutch manual? Sometime in the 1500s, of practice around archives and records. And that's what we do every day without realizing, I think, for most of us, that our practice pattern reflects organizing information to achieve, for specific needs and a specific outcome. And I think when you go and you really look at people's work, ours included, what you find very quickly is that the way the work is organized is literally the work, because in most cases people aren't digging ditches anymore. They are moving information around to achieve specific outcomes that may result in the digging of ditches. But if you change the organization, you're fundamentally changing the work and you are disorganizing the work. And I think it's something we need to talk about. And, for me at the moment, it's particularly important because one of the things that I'm looking to do through RIMPA and the ambassador role that I have there is to look at practice transitions and to look at some of these patterns and assess whether or not, do they make sense, and what should we be thinking about transitioning to. And so I'm really glad we get an opportunity to talk about it today because I'm really trying to make sense of it myself. What do you both think?
Yeah, I think the concept of a custodial hangover is the perfect way of putting it, because I think I've been witness to a lot of conversations that pretty much acknowledge this and pretty much are looking for other ways. And I think it's probably very natural that even when having those conversations, we sort of are blinded to how deep some of the sort of ingrained practices go. I find that as a common example of that, and I feel like it's one we've brought up before, uh, the whole business classification scheme thing, there's some part of me that says, what's it for? Why do we still do that? I wonder if the idea that we need something like a business classification scheme in order to drive our way of appraising the value of information, if even that is, not necessarily true or not a sort of a hard and fast thing that we ought to stick to nowadays. And we've talked before about the increasing possibilities for reuse of information across multiple parts of an organization. And that's one, uh, I'm going to say simple, but of course it creates complexity. But it's one simple way of thinking about how expecting that information has value because of its line of business in which it was created, its function, its activity, that doesn't necessarily stack up because it doesn't praise or it doesn't, count for or bring consideration to the other ways in which information could be used. And we could go all the way back to our data valuation or information valuation conversations we were having earlier about different ways that you might seek to monetize or leverage or extract value from information that just far exceed the idea that, oh well, this, we've got this information because of this activity. And even were we to sort of be able to point to the fact the activity connects to a particular line of business, we shouldn't assume that that's the only thing that that information relates to, or that that's the only value we could get from that information. So, slightly long-winded way of saying that even something as basic as the business classification scheme, I wonder if that's a hangover.
For sure, I would say absolutely for sure, and maybe even before that, thinking about things in terms of series and sub-series and that whole
Mm-hmm.
model is definitely a hangover from that time. And surely, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the business classification scheme was designed specifically for records management, not for users.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that the things of a particular type that should be appraised together would be together.
And there
Yeah.
there is an argument that it has value for findability, that, the arguments around sort of the idea that it's stable, that it's easier to understand compared to organization charts, those that's often asserted. But I don't think it changes what it was primarily created to do, yeah, or intended to do, or why it has so often been implemented, which is basically so that we can do this stuff to do with
Yeah.
retention and disposal that was once upon a time our
And
job.
I'm also thinking that, I mean, if we go right back to custodial practice, if I go back to thinking about what my mum and dad did in government, they both worked in the registry
Oh
of
wow.
the Foreign Office in the UK, and my father was one of the people responsible for developing the scheme that they used to organise what they were storing there. But the point I was thinking was there are those people who work in or were in the registry who are the information intermediaries, if you like. So they are the custodians that you're talking about there, Karl. And so if I want to find something, I go to a custodian, like I might go to a librarian in previous time, and say, I need this. Can you find it for me? And they know where to find it because they, in the case of archives, they've or business papers, they have worked out this system for storing the papers. In the case of libraries, there is this system for organising your books and so on, Dewey Decimal or UDC or whatever it is. So, and the librarians have their nice faceted classifications and all that so that they can help you find the information that you need. But now we don't have those intermediaries. Or we have records managers, but we don't go to the records managers to ask us to find stuff. We just want to let them get on with the retention and disposal. So those intermediaries aren't there anymore, quite rightly. Yeah, it's a different focus.
Mm. Yeah. But I think I think early on, I'm laughing because I mean I think in an early episode I raised the question of what if we weren't going to talk about retention and disposal? What if that was off the table? What else
That's
would we
right.
be
Yeah,
doing?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
I still kind of think, yeah, like why is our work so oriented around this thing that we don't even get done? We don't even get
Well,
disposal
that
happening.
that is a fantastic point, actually. That's an absolutely brilliant point. Why is so much time spent on something that doesn't even actually really get done or fully done?
Seldom gets
I mean,
done. Yeah, not in a
it's
systematic way.
but it's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, as soon as you said BCS, you immediately thought functional. And as soon as we started talking valuation, I mean, valuation in records management. Well, I mean, I was on a webinar recently, and somebody was asking some questions about valuation, and immediately it was, well, your long-term retention records, versus your short-term retention records, not how much is this record worth to you? How much does it drive your business?
Mm.
And I mean, I guess, just on the topic of what we were just talking about, I mean, the sort of implication there is, well, we're actually permanently retaining almost everything now. So, I mean, sure, that means everything is infinitely valuable, right? But I think it's good to think about implementation methods too, because, I mean, how would a BCS have been implemented, when we were literally using cards to find records? This drawer is, that, activity, the cards for that activity if you want this activity. And so, like, it's literally, I mean, it's almost textbook metadata, because it's literally, we go and we look at a drawer, and then we pull that drawer out, and it's got all the cards associated
Mm.
with, you know
Of course. Yeah.
transactions for that activity in it. And then we've immediately gone and said, well, that's not how the information itself is organized. That's how the index for the information is organized. And so we've immediately, we've got this electronic thing, and we love this sort of files and folders and cabinets and everything else kind of, metaphor, because that's how we've looked at it for a long time.
Long
And
time.
so what
Yeah.
do? We immediately try and recreate exactly the same thing in a records management system to try and get everyone to use it. They just don't think like that. But that automatic BCS assumption, I think that's a really, as a BCS as functional kind of assumption. I find that really interesting,
Yeah, sure. I
because
mean, I don't want to sound defensive about that, but I mean, I would use a BCS in contrast to, for instance, just a broader taxonomy, or just a
Mm.
hierarchy of topics or
Mm.
whatever. So I mean, for me, a BCS is about the fact that it's this records management tool, and it has, at least historically, always been around the functions, with except
I default to it. I think I find it really hard to stop myself thinking like that. And I have to continually remind myself that, every time I go and talk to somebody else, that they just do not think about the records they're creating like that.
yeah, yeah,
What do you mean this is a, whatever it is, in a financial context, I'm doing a home loan. Why are you trying to call it something else? Why are you trying to call it this thing so you can put it in a bucket
yeah,
with all of these other things that are secured contracts as well? When I'm doing a home loan, and if you don't call it a home loan, I'm not going to be able to find it, because I don't understand what you're doing over here.
yeah. Why don't you just call it the thing?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
and
we've talked about this before quite a bit, I think. And I suspect that it's that term business classification scheme that has become the dirty word or phrase, really. I mean, I still think that you could build, you could definitely build a business classification scheme that it reflects the business, and
mm,
is the primary way that you organize your content based on what the business does and what the business needs. And sitting beside that, there are all these other lovely ways that you can get at all the information you need, including if you're a records manager.
I
So, I
mean,
mean,
there's
maybe we just have to ban the expression business classification scheme and talk about the information architecture, or, whatever we want to call it going forwards.
there's so many assumptions built into it though too. I mean, it makes, this is where I think the archives versus records versus day-to-day business kind of thing is really interesting to look at, because in an archival situation, I mean, I can see things like functional classification that would that really do, if you really want to look over the horizon, you want to keep things for a long time. I mean, I can understand that being a really useful idea, or some approximation of it, some form of description that kind of has that same long-term focus. But I think it also reflects very bureaucratic ideas, as in, one person does a piece of work and then they go to the next person for approval, and then they kind of go to the next person for approval after that. So there's this very linear flow of kind of work going on. But modern organizations, I mean, they don't really work like that. There's no single point of authority for lots of things that happen. I mean, generally, a piece of work comes in over here and it goes through these 25 people, and they do bits, and bits of the work get split up so that there's more specialized among different people, and eventually it gets to the end. But that whole idea that we would have a file that would be the complete record of a business activity, I mean, that whole concept and that whole desire to maintain it, I think is part of what's destroying records management in structured data contexts, because we just can't think about, I mean, it's a classic idea, like the value chain idea from Michael Porter in the 1970s. Just this idea that you needed to think about all of the different activities that were interdependent that contributed to this outcome that you were trying to achieve. I mean, it's very antithetical, I think, to what's to practice assumptions for records management and archival management. In the custodial era. I mean, I'd argue we're still in the custodial era because our practice patterns haven't changed mostly.
Yeah. One thing that I've definitely seen in terms of data and talking about business systems and things is if we're trying to think big about how do we kind of break down what the organization does and how do we group information in order to maximize its reuse, then typically I'm going to use the dreaded word, but I'm going to say customer. But what I mean is that normally information related to a particular subject, a consumer of services, a citizen, a person, but it could be another kind of a legal entity, like it could be a company or whatever. Like the um, normally what I'm seeing is that people are trying to figure out how to join all of that up. They're saying that
Definitely.
something around value and interoperability and around sort of better use of stuff, or yeah, delivering value outside the kind of records framework, that typically comes down to kind of grouping it around a person or an entity that
Mm.
Or the next
interacts.
stage in the process that needs to consume that information, instead of the
Right?
idea
Yeah.
that we may have to be accountable for something we did 10 years into the future, and so we need to store something in a way that doesn't make sense to anyone who is doing the work.
Yeah. I mean, but to sort of extend what I'm thinking of here, if if we said, oh, certain kinds of interactions with this person, we don't really give a crap and we can just chuck them out anytime, versus certain kinds of interactions we should retain for much longer, um, there's some level at which that's probably okay in an organization, but largely people would say, no, 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 that doesn't make sense. People routinely talk about, oh, we want the complete picture, and the complete
Yeah.
picture means everything about someone, or
Yeah.
where again someone might be some other kind of an organization or entity like that. That's what I often see. And what I mean is those people who are saying those things are not information and records people. They are people who are in the structured space or in the
Yeah.
business space, or
Yeah.
talking about how do we join this stuff up, how do we group it, how do we see this picture.
Mm.
And I guess for me, that's really, really disconnected from the concept that we retain information because it relates to a particular activity. Yeah,
I
There-
totally agree with that, and mainly because I think
sure.
so much of the work I've done in the last few years has been exactly around that, exactly around trying to join up that information around, primarily around a customer, client, whatever you want to call them, but also around organizations. And I think you're exactly right that the organization wants to be able to see absolutely everything. Don't care how um, unimportant the interaction with this client seems to be. We want to know about it, because if we don't, something bad might happen. We might slip up. We might miss something. There might be an overlap in, what people are doing. So we want to store absolutely every interaction that we've had with this particular customer, for example.
But I think there's a subtlety there, though, too, which is that I think for data people, quality of the data is a focus. They're not looking at information and records as, something that, in the classic kind of archival idea, sort of accumulates and, it's just whatever dross sort of falls out of that process, you just kind of hang on to that. I mean, the data people that I work with, they are defining, they're not saying we're just going to accumulate whatever rubbish ends up with us. We're going to say, what do we need? What's the purpose? What's the quality level that we need to capture it at? How do we make sure that happens? When can we use it downstream? What are the requirements of that thing? And I mean, I think by the time they get around to some of those wider purposes where they're starting to say, correct me if you disagree, but I think by the time they get around to some of those wider purposes, they've kind of covered off 95% of the value stuff. And then they're starting to look at the risk side of things and saying, well, we keep having this thing happening over here. And so we need to understand those interactions that are happening because they tell us something about this. And they generally have some kind of statistical kind of framework for thinking about it. So, I mean, they're really thinking about the quality of the information and how it drives their business. And, quality the way data people think about quality, which is, I want a field here that is for first name and it will have a length of 15 characters and, not quality of, well, I have this great big mountain of paper and I want to make sure that I have these 10 metadata fields so that I can comply with Dublin Core and do a transfer to my archive. They're not thinking about the way it's described. They're thinking about the
Well, that's
actual information itself.
Yeah.
that thing you described in terms of what it's not, the Dublin core kind of view. I mean, that's quality of registry entries, isn't it? Like if you
Yeah.
say we want metadata to describe this well, um, not to. It's not about the quality of the information itself. And I'm sure we've said before that many information or records person would say, oh, that's not our responsibility. Like it's
Yeah.
absolutely the thing we do not do. And we've talked before about, basically that
Isn't it
cuts you
such a
out of a
custodial?
lot of positive, you know, potential interactions where you basically just help people to get that quality.
But isn't it such a custodial idea? We're not worried about what we've got. We're worried about how it's described so that we can adequately maintain custody of it. And when we're just
Yeah,
maintaining custody, the quality of the thing doesn't matter because all we worry about is how it's described so we can maintain custody effectively. I don't know, description, description's bigger than that. But
yeah,
I mean, in a records management context, I mean, that's what we continually come back to. It's let's describe this so we can keep it, but we're not keeping anymore because, well, we are keeping, but we're not holding in custody. And that failure to look the next level down. Again, I think that's another big hangover of, the custodial era.
yeah. I think one where it crosses over is that no archivist I've talked to wants to open their box that was handed their way to, be sent to archive that actually is full of rubbish. Like no one wants to go, oh, the stuff that, yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which the quality of that container or file or whatever, it would disappoint people if that was full of crap, basically. But
Mm.
but I think what's not there is that idea of quality as it relates to the ability to deliver results for an organization, so it's not looking at the quality of the information so that it helps someone. It's just like so that it helps someone. That's really harsh. Archives
No,
exist to
but I
help
think
people, but you know what I mean, like on the
Yeah.
day to
Yeah.
day.
I think
Yeah.
I reckon a really compelling example of where this kind of longer term view is at odds with another sort of different view of value that's just tied to a business outcome is something like a patient record. Like that's a perfect example of something that's based around, a person, a
Mm.
subject in the sense of a human, um, and the value of that thing's not about that really long-term retention. Like, sure, you might get better health outcomes over time, and there's always opportunities for reuse and la 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 la. But the quality of the information right now for that person who's dealing with some health issue, and we're trying to help them with it,
Yeah.
that's that's critical, and that is not that long-term view at all when it comes to appraising the value of that stuff. And to me, that's a really easy, compelling example. It also sidesteps if you sort of get a bit, if you work in government, you're not thinking in a sort of commercial framework. It doesn't have to be a commercial conversation. Like that, that's just a perfect example of where information is of incredibly high value and potentially not for a long time, and that
Mm.
that doesn't diminish how valuable it is in the short term.
Mm,
And so it's a really different lens. Um, and I think it does drive really different conversations, because if you were part of a team that was trying to make sure that in that example, you had really high quality patient data, the kinds of work you'd be doing, your activities, the points of focus, your priorities would be really different to saying, okay, my EDRMS is going to,
Mm.
really kick ass when it comes to applying our BCS today. Yeah.
And I think there's quite a few examples. I mean, I think the patient record is an excellent one because all of it is so important for that patient and for the
Mm,
doctor working with them. And going back to our customer relationship management systems, I think it's not as crucial on a day-to-day basis, but still very important. And a lot of those if we can call them this line of business systems, like if you're doing, oh, I don't know, permissioning, or there are so many business activities that require that level, and inland revenue, they need to keep all that tax information. Absolutely. So wherever the work that you're doing is information heavy, where it's absolutely crucial that it's very obvious that your work revolves around getting this right, um, then I think the quality of information it's so important that people are going to pay good attention to it.
the,
And
the
and and the record keeping side of it is actually going to be secondary,
I mean, the
I
thing that
would say.
I'm the secondary piece. I mean, completely. Yes, I think the interesting thing for me about this conversation that we're having, and some of my assertions is that, I have this definition of organizational culture that I just love. It's from a guy named Ed Kashine, and basically what it says is that, you know, you end up with culture because you've had to solve a bunch of problems, and very quick the things that are important get, and maybe I'll send you, I'll see if I can send you the full thing, Michael, so we can put it in the show notes. But the thing that happens is that as you solve all of those problems, you learn to see the world in a specific way. And if those are solutions that work over time, then generations of practitioners teach those ways of seeing the world, ways of seeing those problems and the solutions to them as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to the problems that you're dealing with. And it's just funny because while we've been talking, I've been sitting there going, I've been trying to square this circle for a long time, and I've been dancing around this very simple idea, which is that, ultimately, if you want a result, from information, and if you think information can have an impact on your result, well, the way you figure that out is you go and look at the results and you work out what specific information you need at what level of quality to produce that result. And the
Hmm.
interesting thing for me is that I think records people generally, we have a very specific idea about what quality means, and we go to everyone and we impose that definition of quality on everybody. Because what do we need to achieve good custodial practice? We need good metadata, and we have specified exactly the metadata that we need and the way of implementing it to produce very good outcomes if we have to manage the custody of records. That's what records metadata, description standards, Commonwealth Record Series, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's what they are all designed for. They have this objective of long-term, custodial management of these things. And the spec that, the way information is specified produces that beautifully. The thing is that we've then tried to impose that on everybody to say this is the best way to do it, when exactly as you say, we're not dealing with that stuff anymore. We're dealing with patient records. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, no, if we want to get a good outcome for a patient, then the spec is different. And the way we organize the information is different. And it's a value judgment, which I almost, now that I'm kind of saying it, I almost don't know why I had to, but it feels really obvious, but also it's one of those, this definition of culture talks about these things as basic assumptions because they start out as being explicit things you do and then they fade from view. And the only way you can actually understand them is to look at the way people behave and hypothesize about the rules that they're following. And I feel like we've got a lot of these things. I think this is the big point about custodial practice for me, and that underlies everything. It's that we solved a bunch of problems, we learned some patterns, and then we did the patterns for so long we forgot why we did them. And now we teach those things to people without really being clear on why we're teaching them. And I think that's what's hurting us. And I think the patient example is perfect.
Righty, I reckon that's probably a perfect place to wrap that up. And yeah, it'd be great to hear from people out there if you have opinions on this one. I hope you do. I could throw a last comment in there and wonder out loud how much what we're talking about is actually knowledge management, but
Oh,
I'll leave that there.
Eek.
Alrighty,
okay.
thanks all. See ya.
See you next time.